Welcome to the Salish Sea Fellowship Sunday afternoon service from February 16th. Our speaker today is Dr. Joyce Francis, and she will speak on the topic of nature's grace. We hope you enjoy this recording of our service, and we hope to see you in person some Sunday afternoon. Thanks for listening.
When I was a boy, each week on Sunday we would go to church, pay attention to the priest as he would read the holy word, and if consecrate the holy bread, everyone would kneel and bow. Today the only difference is everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. When I was in Sunday school, we would learn about the time Moses split the sea in two, Jesus made the water wine. And I remember feeling sad, miracles don't happen still. Now I can't keep track, 'cause everything's a miracle. Everything's a miracle. Wine from water is not so small, but an even better magic trick is that anything is here at all. So the challenging thing becomes is not to find a miracle, finding where there isn't one. When holy water was rare at best, barely wet my fingertips. Now I have to hold my breath like I'm swimming in a sea of it. It used to be a world out there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. Now I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. Read a questioning child's face and say it's not a testament. That'd be very hard to say. See another new morning come, say it's not a sacrament. I tell you that it can't be done. This morning outside I stood, saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush, singing like a scripture verse. Made me want to bow my head. I remember when church let out, how things have changed since then, 'cause everything is holy now. It used to be a world out there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-down. Now I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Everything is holy now.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Salish Sea Fellowship. We are an independent, liberal religious community, born from a struggle to protect our right for freedom of speech and our desire for open discussion and debate of church practice and dogma. We encourage lives lived with loving hearts and open minds, embracing the traditional principles of Unitarianism and Universalism. My name is David Rimpf. I'm the pulpit assistant today. Our speaker is Dr. Joyce Francis, and her sermon is titled Nature's Grace. I now invite you to settle in and quiet your minds. Lighting the chalice, let me say this is a new day that has been given to us. Let us rejoice in it and be glad. Let us be grateful for this time of fellowship, for work to do and service to render. And let us then be especially grateful for the ties of love that bind us together, giving dignity, meaning, and worth to all our days. And you may remember what happened the last time I tried this.
I like that. Hello, all of you. Thank you for being here. It's good to see you. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you my personal story of nature's grace. Those hard-to-explain events some might call miraculous. Dan Wakefield has written much about the miraculous things that happen to ordinary people in his book, Expect a Miracle, from which I have taken today's reading. This universe into which we were born and this planet on which we walk are unearned gifts. That's what grace is. Take gravity, or rather take it away, and this planet and everything on it would fly apart. Grace is unearned. Life itself is a grace. We didn't earn the right to be born. We didn't have to ask to be born. Birth came to us as a gift. When we think of grace, we usually think of something out of the ordinary, even what we call a miracle or supernatural. We think of biblical stories of healing, of bringing the dead back to life, of water turning into wine. In the process, we have forgotten the everyday graces that take place right under our noses all the time. If you would appreciate grace, look for it in ordinary places. I would now invite you to relax and perhaps even close your eyes if you want, while you listen to Joe Euro's beautiful guitar rendition of Amazing Grace.
She almost wouldn't let me introduce her. You know her, but we know Joyce is a lifelong teacher. First of chemistry, and then of physics at the secondary level. I wish she had been my science teacher instead of the football coach. Later, she taught at universities in the States and around the world. She is a 20-year resident of Port Townsend, where she was an active member of the QUUF Unitarian Fellowship for many years. When she could no longer openly share her thoughts and concerns at QUUF, she and several other like-minded individuals began the long process that led to the creation of our Salish Sea Fellowship. She will be reprising a sermon she gave at QUUF in 2010. She hopes this time with more grace. 15 years ago, she was quite new to the fellowship, and her pulpit assistant, Celeste Dybeck, can attest that Joyce was visibly shaking and spoke in a very tight voice. This time she will share a story that began in Iraq more than 50 years ago and which remains a touchstone in her life. Please welcome to our pulpit a very confident and strong Dr. Joyce Francis.
Tall now, yeah. Actually, it's Iran, fortunately. Yeah. Nope. We are, no doubt, all familiar with the refrain from that wonderful spiritual we just heard, Joe Europe play. Aren't we blessed to have him in our community? That refrain goes, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." The author of this hymn, his name is John Newton, was, as you may well remember, a former slave ship captain who later in life came to realize the inhumanity of his deeds, found redemption in Christianity, and became an Anglican minister and an abolitionist. John Newton's beautiful spiritual represents, for me, the Christian notion of grace, being redeemed by God, a blessing that may be bestowed when one finds faith in God. In the second stanza of his hymn, Newton goes on to say, "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed." Now, my reading of Newton's God is one that calls believers to accept God's divinity and power and thus obey. In return, believers may trust that their God offers forgiveness and grace in this life. Newton says, "'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far." Newton's God also offers salvation in the afterlife. "And grace will lead me home," Newton says. Newton's hymn is perhaps the iconic notion of Christian grace. While I understand this view to be a comfort to many, it is not a belief that I can personally hold. I'm an agnostic, believing I can have no evidence, no knowledge through my senses, nor my reason, that there is a creator, a loving or redeeming God, or an afterlife. Thus, God's not a topic I spend time exploring. I choose to concentrate on trying to fully love and live in this life. However, I refuse to relinquish to the deists a belief in grace. Doris Lessing, the late Nobel Prize-winning British author, perhaps best captures my notion of grace, my agnostic's notion, something given by nature in her role of spendthrift. I love that expression. My personal graces are blessings that I can and I have been generously offered from life, from nature, if you will, without my earning them. Inspired by Doris Lessing, I like to call them nature's graces. Newton and most Christian theologians hold that God's grace comes to believers when they are at their lowest, spiritually lost in despair. In contrast, my experience of nature's graces have come on ordinary days when I was stumbling through my ever so ordinary life. It is one experience of nature's grace that I want to explore with you today, and I do mean explore, as it's still a source of somewhat of wonder and mystery to me today, 50 years later. And to do so, I want to tell you a story. Most of my story revolves around Iran, and I hope in doing so, I leave you with thoughts of that country beyond the current headlines. When I was a junior at Kansas State University studying chemistry, amazingly, I made my first international friend while working part-time in the School of Agriculture's toxicology lab. Zia Rafi was from Iran, a PhD student in agronomy, which is a fancy name for soil management. Zia often stopped by the lab to check on the work I was doing and to tease me about my job. I was supposed to grind up with solvent in a blender, of all things, frozen bodies of field mice that were captured in a fertilized test cornfield. Remember, this was Kansas, where corn is king. You know that.
Wheat is king.
Kansas, corn. We'll agree to disagree. How's that? I did this so that I could inject the resultant liquid into a gas liquid chromatograph, or a GLC, to measure the amount of chemical. Somebody's nodding like they know about this. The amount of chemical fertilizer residue that remained in their bodies. This told researchers, of course, what the fertilizer was adding to the food chain. By the way, this job did cure me of any notion I might have had of being a chemical researcher. But as I say, it did give me my first international friend. Zia got his PhD, went home to teach at Tehran University. I got my bachelor's degree in science teaching credential and moved to San Francisco. We kept in touch through occasional letters. And over the next few years, now and again, Zia would encourage me to think about what an adventure it would be if I got a job teaching in Iran. In 1972, my first love traded me in on a more glamorous version. And I decided a geographic cure was in order. So I took up Zia's suggestion, took it to heart. Having absolutely no clue how one went about getting a job abroad, I simply sat down one night in my ignorance and wrote a letter addressed Minister of Education, Tehran, Iran. I kid you not. I simply assumed there was a Ministry of Education. I assumed it was in Tehran. I assumed it was a male. Dear Minister, I'd like a job. Here's my resume. Amazingly, and surely the first grace of this story, 3 weeks later, a contract arrived in the mail. Offering me a job teaching science, and they were needing science teachers, I think. Offering me a job in an international school, private international school in Tehran, along with a one-way airline ticket. I'd never been past St. Louis at that point. The Tehran Community School largely served Persian students who aspired to attend college in the US or Great Britain in English, thereby circumventing the highly competitive road to one of the only 2 universities at that time in Iran. Thus, I went, and it was indeed the adventure that Zia had promised, and so much more. I taught charming and engaged students in an excellent school. I skied in the lightest powder I've ever experienced. I learned to really speak my first foreign language, and I fell in love with the Persian people and their culture. This was, of course, the beginning of my devotion to and later career in international relations. My friend Zia helped me every step of the way. He met me at the airport, introduced me to his friends, his culture, and occasionally rescued me from my cultural blunders. Let me offer one such situation that may convey what a really dear friend and mentor Zia was to me that year. A virulent intestinal flu was making the rounds of the school, and it finally reached Fatima. She was a Persian widow who worked as a housekeeper in many of the school teachers' homes, and she lived in a room in the extra room in my apartment. She was my roommate. She was a grandmother at this time and was thus harder hit than most of us by this flu. The school nurse was treating us, and the treatment came in the form of a suppository. Now, my Farsi at that time was sufficient for me to say to Fatima, "This is medicine for you. Do not eat it. It goes in the other end." For those of you who speak another language, I would challenge you to explain in that language with a suppository. Not part of the usual language curriculum, and I recently checked my Farsi English dictionary to confirm that the relevant body part is not listed. From Fatima's confused expression, I could tell that my abbreviated explanation wasn't going to get the job done. So I called Zia. As you might imagine, my request was way outside his cultural comfort zone. But, dear friend that he was, he did it. Because I was his friend and I needed his help. And Fatima got well. This is just one of his many kindnesses. A good friend, a good man, my Zia. After that year, I went on to 6 more years of adventure in Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, and Denmark. Zia and I each married. Zia had 2 daughters. By the fall of 1979, when I returned to the US, my wandering had caused us to lose touch. I was recently divorced, experiencing cultural reentry shock, living in a friend's guest room, sleeping on a cot, and working in a low-level clerical job in a bank, which is the first thing I could find, because my teaching credential wasn't valid in California at that time. Such was my humble life on the morning of November 4, 1979. When I woke to the news that Iranian militants had stormed the embassy and taken 71 hostages, less well publicized, they had also seized the Tehran University and imprisoned Iranians that were perceived to be in cahoots with the Americans. My friend Zia was American educated, and his research was, last I knew, funded by an American corporation. Thus, he would have been a likely target of the militants. And the last news I'd had from him was that he was still teaching at Tehran University. I feared for my friend, though I hoped he'd been able to see this coming and fled, as he was resourceful and skilled and spoke not only Farsi, but Arabic, French, and English. I immediately realized that I had to find him. Remember, however, I was that recently divorced and somewhat out of cultural element person, a 30-ish bank clerk, very much lacking in confidence and life focus. But that morning, as soon as I heard the news, I had absolutely no doubt that my mission that day was to find Zia. I called my office and informed them without preamble or apology that I had something more important to do than bank clerking that day. I hope I've effectively set the stage for you. A good man was quite possibly in danger and a refugee, and I was the least likely person on the planet to find him. Fortunately, I didn't stop to think about those limitations that day. Excuse me. I called my former boyfriend, ironically, the one whose rejection had sent me abroad in the first place. He had once worked for Eli Lilly Corporation, the company that had funded Zia's research. I asked him to give me the name of the biggest muckety-muck he could think of within Eli Lilly. He came up with the name of the Senior Vice President of Marketing. Without missing a beat, I called Eli Lilly. I asked by name for the Senior VP. I was put through, and as luck would have it, he answered the phone himself. Again, without preamble or apology, I told him about Zia, someone he'd never met, about Zia's former connection to Eli Lilly, about the siege of the embassy and the university, which he hadn't caught up with yet that morning, and about the likely danger that Zia would be in if he were still in Iran, but the possibility that he'd fled and was a refugee. I then tasked the Senior VP with finding Zia. Amazing to me only in retrospect, he accepted the challenge. He assured me that he would get back to me with news before the end of business that day. I could wish I had a recording of that conversation so I'd know what I said that compelled him to pick up my task that day. What is memorable about that day, and again, this awareness is only in retrospect, was my absolute clarity of mission and my total lack of self-doubt. I want you to hear what a unique event that was for me at that time. It was not how I lived my life normally, but on that day, I never doubted that finding Zia was what I needed to do, that I was up to the task, and that the world would provide. I can't now recall how I spent that day nearly 50 years ago, only that I calmly and confidently waited for the phone to ring. Indeed, within about 5 hours, I got a call from the Senior VP's secretary informing me that Zia was alive and well and was in the US attending a conference. He could be reached at a hotel in Florida whose name and phone number she gave me. I promptly called the hotel, asked for Zia's room, and Zia answered. My friend was absolutely astounded, as you might imagine, that I tracked him down. And I do clearly remember his first words because he repeated them over time. Good God, Joyce, the CIA couldn't have found me that fast. And maybe he was right. Finding him was perhaps miraculous, though I only realized again in retrospect. As it turns out, Zia and his family had left Iran ahead of the turmoil. He was working for a pharmaceutical company in Paris. Zia was so taken by the mystery of my finding him so quickly that he later retraced my steps. With great perseverance, that Senior VP had managed to trace Zia through several degrees of professional separation. If you'll allow me a brief aside, I'd like to finish Zia's tale, as it's a great immigrant story, and it's a tie-in to Jean's talk later after the coffee. When so many agronomists were involved in finding Zia that day, he was able to renew some professional connections, and he later made a new career for himself in the US. He educated his daughters at Johns Hopkins. His older daughter, Lily, became a famous handbag designer on her own, with her own boutique on New York's Fifth Avenue. She caught the eye of the legal counsel to the Clinton Foundation, and thus Zia and his wife Mitra were able to host Bill and Chelsea Clinton at their daughter's wedding in Paris in 2007. Hillary was a senator and busy at that time, I guess. This story of finding Zia is my clearest experience of nature's grace. I have no idea where the idea came from to act, how I knew what to do, how I convinced that Senior VP to do my bidding. All of it feels to me like a gift, a blessing, a grace. On that day, I was able to receive one of nature's graces, a grace I like to think is always available to me, as Doris Lessing says, given by nature in her role of spendthrift. I've had other less immediate experiences of nature's grace. The job that came through that letter I sent to the Minister of Education surely qualifies. Those of you who know my young, smart, handsome, loving husband, did I say young? Will acknowledge, as I do, that he surely qualifies. Also, the epiphany I felt the first time I saw Puget Sound 35 years ago has that same quality. Shortly thereafter, I told Nils that I had to live here one day, without any idea of how to make that happen, but with calm assurance that it would, and it did. I'm an agnostic as to the source of these graces. I believe I cannot know. What is more interesting and relevant as a question for me is how I might be more open to nature's graces in life. I would dearly love to wake up every morning of my life as clear of purpose and confidence of success as I was that day I found Zia. Wouldn't that be grand? Reverend Pam, who spoke here 2 weeks ago, inspired me to leave you with this blessing. May the memories we gather here today give you hope for the future. And may the fellowship we share strengthen you and bring joy to your heart. May nature's graces be upon you, now and forever. Thank you.
As I extinguish this flame, I want to suggest that you, as you go about your day-to-day lives this week, stay curious, be of service to your community, and be kind to your friends, your family, and above all, be kind to yourself. Thank you.
Closing words?